What's up, Internet? Jordan here from Air to the Mead, and today I'm going to be doing a 2-year tasting on my second ever mead, an Orange Blossom Traditional. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now, I do want to give you guys a little bit of background on the recipe and the process for this one, and remember, this is my second ever mead. Like many of you, I did not start off with a fully developed set of implementing all of the best modern practices with full-blown nutrients and all that stuff. I tried to keep it relatively simple, and that was an important step for me at the time in making the entire hobby feel accessible enough that I was willing to try at all. So I don't want to undermine the importance or the validity of approaching it that way if that's what makes you happy and if that's what makes it possible for you to have the confidence needed to try. But I do want to bring it up because there's going to be a lot of room for improvement on this mead. With that in mind, let's take a look, starting with what I wrote down for the recipe. I have 13.5 cups of filtered and boiled water, which I now find to be humorously specific, 4 pounds of orange blossom honey from the grocery store, 4 grams of Lafort Spark yeast, which has an on-paper ABV tolerance of 17% and is actually advertised as being so hardy that it's useful for restarting stuck fermentations. You would think that would be a good yeast to start off with if you don't have a fully developed process yet, and your yeast are probably going to be lacking a little bit in departments like nutrition. We'll see how that turned out. My first observation on this is that while a lot of traditional meads are very simple, I mean, they are supposed to be just honey, water, yeast, essentially, I didn't do any acid tannin balancing on this one. Even for relatively beginner level traditional recipes, it's pretty common for me to see somebody suggest that you do something like toss in a bag of black tea to add tannins and fill out the body and mouthfeel of that mead a little bit, and I didn't even do that here. And then on top of that, keep in mind that this is an orange blossom traditional. I'm not using some sort of rich, earthy honey here that might have significant amounts of its own body to bring to the mead. I'm using a fairly light, kind of citrusy floral varietal. Mead describes it as light and fragrant. So between the two, I'm expecting very little body on this one. With a quick note about balancing out of the way, I'd like to pivot back to ABV. Remember, my yeast, Spark, is rated on paper for 17%, but this mead finished at just under 14%. Now, finishing under my yeast's on-paper tolerance at all, unless it's because I did it on purpose by not giving it enough sugar to ferment all the way, is always going to be an indicator that my fermentation was stressed, but falling over 3% shy is pretty significant. I don't think I've had any other mead come that short of the on-paper tolerance while there were still sugars left to ferment. And there were sugars left in this one. We ended up finishing about 10.24 for our final gravity, which should be a fairly sweet mead. If the yeast were happy and healthy, they should have had plenty left to ferment here. And I find it especially remarkable because, again, Spark is advertised for restarting stuck fermentations. I stalled out that yeast. And when I look on my notes at nutrition, it makes sense. This early on in my mead making journey, I was trying to use boiled yeast as nutrients. While yeast hulls are a form of nutrient, if you make them the way that I did back then, where I mixed yeast with boiling water to neutralize the yeast so that it wouldn't interfere with the yeast I was trying to use for fermentation, and then try to measure out how much to add, it's a shot in the dark. What you really need to do is find some way, if you're gonna use that method at all, to measure out your yeast before you mix it with water so that you have an accurate sense of how much nutrition you're actually adding. So these days, I will either just buy the actual Fermate-O, which is the best solution, or I will bake my yeast to make yeast hulls and then add it as a powder, which is a lot easier to measure. I treat it similarly to Fermate-O, but round up pretty aggressively because it's not quite literally the same thing and doesn't work quite as well. But I hadn't figured all that out when I did this mead. Again, it was my second ever, so I didn't try to measure out how much nutrition I was adding until I had already mixed yeast and water. I think as a result, even though I was trying to use some kind of nutrition here, I didn't have a very good schedule, and I didn't have a very good sense of how much I was adding in, and the yeast just got underfed. Since this is a traditional mead with no additional ingredients, no fruit, no tea, nothing, I think that the yeast just didn't really have anything available other than sugar, which isn't going to ferment fantastically. And I know there are those of you who prefer to keep things as natural as possible, and you're probably pointing out that 14% ABV is nothing to sneeze at, and you're not wrong. That's totally fair. 14% ABV is actually still a fairly strong mead in my opinion, but it did stall. It should have been able to get to 17% or higher, and it stopped well over 3% shy of that. These kinds of stalls and other issues are the risks you are accepting if you try to make things the all-natural way or whatever, instead of implementing some of the modern ideas that we figured out, like nutrition schedules and Ferment O, Ferment K, stuff like that. Because this stalled out, I tried adding more yeast slurry a couple different times to see if I could help it along, but it didn't do a whole lot. I think it was too little too late. We were already stuck, and because this is a high ABV tolerance yeast at 17%, I think there was too much alcohol for fermentation to easily restuck by the time we got close to 14%. This ended up in primary for 2 whole months before I finally gave up on it after seeing the gravity stall out for 7 days and racked it. My last note here is that I did end up filtering this batch through my Buonvino mini jet, and I actually used the same filters that I processed a batch of my Black Dragon's Blood with. If you haven't seen that video yet, it's a Bochet Melomel with coffee in it. It's very dark and rich, and using the same filter pads to put this traditional mead through at the time, I observed did have a small impact. Not a huge one, but it did impart a little bit of aroma and a little bit of color. I did this mostly as an experiment. I wanted to see what would happen, and I noticed that the Buonvino mini jet has a set of pads rated for 5 gallons. The Black Dragon's Blood was 3, and this traditional was only a 1-gallon batch. So even by doing the 2 batches, I was still at only 4 of the 5 gallons the filter pads are supposed to be rated for. I'll let you know in the tasting if it had any long-term impact on the mead or not. And that said, on to the tasting. By my palate, which is not the most sensitive nor the most well-trained, this is fairly pleasant. It tastes almost exactly like other traditional meads that I have had, especially ones that did not have any sort of acid-tannin balancing like a tea bag added. It is both sweet and old enough that it is mostly smooth. It tastes, as it should given it's a traditional, mostly of honey, with some of those standard orange blossom notes. And as expected, it does lack body. It finishes very weak. All of the aromas and flavors introduced by orange blossom are pretty front-loaded. They'll hit you in the nose and in the beginning of the taste. By the time you get to the back end and the swallow and the retronasal, there's nothing there. It has no body, it has no flavor, it's just kind of empty. That said, I don't pick up anything offensive about the mead, I just wish there was more to it. So all things considered, it's not a bad result for a second ever mead. Now whereas I mostly just taste and smell the orange blossom honey, better noses than mine were able to pick out a small impact caused by recycling the same filter pads I used on Black Dragon's Blood. I was told that the mead actually smelled like the jar that cherries had been stored in, which I thought was kind of cool. I was also told that it still tasted a little young, very alcohol forward, much like a young wine would. And while I do admit that 14% is a fairly strong beverage, I can't help but attribute this youngness to the stressed fermentation. At 2 years old, I think we should be past the point where this tastes young to people, even at 14% ABV. And the fact that it does just tells me that this fermentation really has a lot of room for improvement. But ultimately, I am pretty happy with this. The taste test is perfectly in line with my expectations when I go back and review my process and my recipe. 2 years of aging has done the bulk of the work in cleaning up the mess that I made with a stressed fermentation, but it could benefit from a little more aging yet still. And personally, I see the results as an affirmation of both camps. The side that wants to brew things naturally and the side that wants to use modern stuff like powders. The truth is, I got a 14% ABV mead out of this that tastes pretty good. And I could have addressed some of its biggest weaknesses with a recipe adjustment on the natural side, like a little bit of black tea. But it also affirms the argument that we should use modern techniques when we can. This did stall out. It didn't hit its on-paper ABV tolerance, and I'd bet if I used the exact same recipe again with the exact same nutrients, I would get a different result in terms of what ABV I hit, which makes it really difficult to reproduce this recipe and anticipate accurately what my final gravity is going to be. It might turn out sweeter or significantly more dry next time. And while it does taste pretty pleasant now, it took 2 years to get here. There are certainly benefits to using a more streamlined process that gives me a healthier and more reliable fermentation. At the end of the day, I do support you brewing in whatever way brings you joy. I think that's kind of the point of a hobby in the first place. It should be something that makes you happy. Regardless of where you fall on the chart between modern and natural or whatever you want to call them, I'm glad that you're here and you've made it this far in the video. Without getting too deep into personal life, I am going through a remodel at the moment and don't actually have space for a bunch of brewing, hence the stall out in the number of videos I've been posting. But I haven't forgotten you guys, I'm still alive, and I do intend to keep making videos. And frankly, I don't know yet how long it'll be until I can start posting videos more regularly again, but I did notice a lot of my old brews are now reaching either their 1 year or their 2 year mark. So while I can't make any promises, I am gonna try to get some more of these tasting videos out for you guys, where we take a look at some of my older brews and see how they turned out, or didn't. That all said, thank you so much for joining me, and have a good however long until I see you again. 'Cause I'm still looking